It began with something so small that, at first, it didn't even feel like a conflict worth noticing. A fence. Not a towering structure, not something aggressive or provocative, just a simple wooden fence that I had installed along what I believed was the edge of my property. It was practical, modest, and built for privacy. After years of dealing with a lack of clear boundaries, I finally wanted something that defined my space. The neighborhood I lived in had always carried an unspoken tension beneath its calm surface. It was governed by a homeowners association, the kind that presented itself as orderly and professional, but often blurred the line between maintaining standards and overstepping boundaries. Still, I had managed to stay under the radar for years. I followed the rules, kept my property clean, and avoided unnecessary attention. That changed the moment the fence went up. The notice arrived just 3 days after installation. It was formal, sharply worded, and unmistakably hostile in tone. According to the HOA, my fence violated community guidelines. It was described as visually inconsistent and structurally non-compliant, though no specific measurements or rules were cited. It felt less like a genuine concern and more like a complaint dressed in official language. At the bottom of the notice, there was a reference number, one that tied the complaint directly to a resident submission. I didn't need to guess who it was. My neighbor had always been attentive, the kind of person who noticed everything, commented on everything, and quietly enforced her own version of neighborhood standards. She had never directly confronted me before, but there had been subtle signs, lingering looks, small remarks about appearances, and an unmistakable sense that she believed she had authority over things that were not hers to control. The fence, apparently, had crossed a line. At first, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. I reviewed the HOA guidelines carefully, going through every section related to fencing, property lines, and exterior modifications. What I found was surprisingly vague. There were general recommendations about height and materials, but nothing that clearly prohibited what I had built. In fact, my fence seemed to fall well within acceptable limits. So I responded politely. I submitted documentation of the design, the materials, and even the contractor's compliance with standard building codes. I expected that would be the end of it. It was. Another notice arrived a week later. This one was more aggressive. It included a warning about fines and a deadline for removal. The language had shifted from concern to enforcement, and it was clear that someone was pushing the issue beyond what the guidelines justified. That's when I started paying closer attention. I noticed how often my neighbor seemed to be watching, not in an obvious way, but enough to feel deliberate. Small details stood out, curtains shifting, her presence appearing just as I stepped outside, the way she paused near the fence line as if inspecting it. It became clear that this wasn't just about aesthetics, it was personal. And the HOA was acting as her tool. The third notice came with a fine attached. It wasn't large, but it wasn't meant to be. It was a signal, a way of escalating pressure without outright confrontation. The expectation was clear. Comply, remove the fence, and restore whatever version of normal they preferred. But something about the situation didn't sit right with me. The more I reviewed the notices, the more inconsistencies I found. The lack of specific violations, the shifting language, the increasing urgency, it all pointed to something beyond standard enforcement. It felt targeted, almost strategic. That's when the thought first crossed my mind. What if the issue wasn't the fence itself? What if the problem was where the fence was placed? Property lines in the neighborhood had always been assumed rather than verified. Most homes followed the same general layout, and boundaries were rarely questioned. But assumptions are not the same as facts. And if this conflict was going to escalate, I needed more than assumptions. I needed certainty. The idea of hearing a surveyor came slowly at first, then all at once. It wasn't a small step. It required time, money, and a willingness to challenge what everyone else seemed to accept as settled. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If the fence was truly on my property, then the HOA had no grounds to force its removal. And if it was, then I needed to know that too. Either way, the truth would shift the balance. So I made the call. The surveyor scheduled a visit for the following week. In the days leading up to it, the tension in the neighborhood seemed to grow. The notices stopped, but the silence felt intentional, as if something was waiting. My neighbor's behavior didn't change, but it became more noticeable. There was a quiet confidence in the way she moved, as though she believed the outcome was already decided. That only strengthened my resolve. When the surveyor arrived, the process was methodical and precise. Measurements were taken, markers were placed, and records were cross-referenced with official property documents. It was the kind of work that left little room for interpretation. As I watched the process unfold, a sense of anticipation built with every step. Because if the results confirmed what I suspected, then this wasn't just about defending my fence anymore. It was about redefining the boundaries entirely. And that realization marked the moment everything began to change. The day the survey results were finalized didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It came quietly, almost uneventfully, wrapped in a set of documents and measurements that carried far more weight than anyone in the neighborhood seemed to realize. There were no dramatic announcements, no immediate reactions, just lines drawn with precision, quietly redefining everything that had been assumed for years. The surveyor walked me through the findings with a calm, methodical approach. Every measurement had been cross-checked against official land records. Every marker placed on the ground corresponded to legally recognized boundaries. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. And the conclusion was clear. The fence wasn't just compliant, it was entirely within my property. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. The real shift came from what the survey revealed beyond the fence line. What had long been treated as a shared understanding of space, informal, unspoken, and rarely questioned, was, in fact, inaccurate. The boundary between my property and my neighbor wasn't where everyone believed it to be. It extended further than expected, cutting through areas that had, over time, been absorbed into her use. Her landscaping, a portion of her decorative pathway, even part of what she seemed to treat as her yard. All of it, according to the survey, fell within my property. For a moment, the implications didn't fully settle in. It felt almost surreal, like uncovering something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The fence, which had been the center of conflict, suddenly became secondary. The real issue, the one that explained the intensity of the complaints, was much deeper. She hadn't just objected to the fence. She had been protecting territory she believed was hers. And now, that belief had been proven wrong. I took time before making any move. The information was powerful, but it required careful handling. Acting too quickly could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Acting too slowly could allow the HOA to continue applying pressure based on outdated assumptions. So I started with documentation. Every detail from the survey was organized, labeled, and prepared for submission. The official report, the marked diagrams, the coordinates, everything that established the legal boundary beyond doubt. It wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about establishing authority. When I submitted the documents to the HOA, the response was noticeably different from before. The tone shifted almost immediately. Where previous notices had been firm and directive, their reply was cautious, almost hesitant. They acknowledged receipt of the survey and stated that they would review the findings in accordance with community guidelines. It was a neutral response on the surface, but the underlying message was clear. The situation was no longer simple. For the first time, the HOA wasn't dictating terms. They were reassessing them. But the silence that followed was more revealing than any formal reply. Days passed without new notices. No fines, no warnings, no further demands about the fence. The issue that had been pushed so aggressively just weeks earlier had suddenly stalled. And in that silence, something else began to shift. My neighbor's behavior changed. The quiet confidence that had once defined her presence was gone, replaced by something less certain. She still moved through her routines, still maintained the same outward composure, but there was a difference, a subtle awareness. a hesitation that hadn't been there before. It became clear that she knew. Whether through the HOA or her own inquiries, the survey results had reached her. And with that knowledge came the realization that the situation was no longer in her control. But instead of stepping back, she doubled down. The next notice from the HOA didn't address the fence directly. Instead, it introduced a new concern, one that hadn't been mentioned before. It referenced landscaping irregularities and potential encroachments affecting community aesthetics. The language was broader, less specific, but unmistakably connected to the same underlying issue. It was an attempt to redirect the conflict. If the fence couldn't be challenged, then something else would be. But this time, the strategy was weaker. Because now, the facts were on record. I responded with the same level of precision as before. The survey documents were resubmitted, this time with additional emphasis on the exact boundaries and the areas affected. Every claim made by the HOA was addressed with evidence, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The difference in their response was immediate. The follow-up communication was brief, almost restrained. They acknowledged the clarification and stated that no further action would be taken pending additional review. It was a step back, even if they didn't frame it that way. For the first time since the conflict began, the pressure was no longer one-sided. But the situation wasn't over. Because while the HOA was adjusting its position, the underlying issue remained unresolved. The land that had been incorrectly used for years was still being treated as if it belonged to my neighbor. The survey had established the truth, but it hadn't yet changed the reality on the ground. And that gap, between what was legal and what was practiced, was where the next decision had to be made. I could leave things as they were, accept the validation, keep the fence, and move on. It would have been the simplest option, the least disruptive. But it wouldn't have addressed the core of the problem. Because the conflict had never been just about the fence. It had been about control. And now, that control had shifted. The question was what to do with it. As I reviewed the survey one more time, tracing the boundary lines that cut through areas long assumed to belong elsewhere, the answer became clearer. The land wasn't just mine on paper. It was mine in full. And if the situation had escalated this far over a fence that was entirely within my rights, then it was time to consider what enforcing those rights would actually look like. The survey had done more than settle a dispute. It had rewritten the entire map of my property. What had once been an invisible line, casually assumed and rarely questioned, was now defined with exact measurements, legal certainty, and consequences that could no longer be ignored. But knowing the truth and enforcing it were two very different things. For several days, I let the information sit, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of what came next. Reclaiming land wasn't just a technical action, it was a visible statement. It would change how the neighborhood saw me, how the HOA responded, and most importantly, how my neighbor reacted. And after everything that had already happened, it was clear that any move I made would be watched closely. So I approached it carefully. The first step wasn't physical, it was procedural. I consulted with a property attorney to confirm what the survey had already suggested. The boundaries were valid, enforceable, and recognized under local law. There were no easements, no shared use agreements, and no legal claims that would override the survey's findings. The land, in every sense that mattered, was mine. That confirmation changed the situation from defensive to strategic. Until now, I had been responding, answering notices, providing documentation, pushing back against claims. But with the legal foundation fully established, I no longer needed to react. I could act. And the first action was simple. I marked the boundary. Using the surveyor's coordinates, I had official boundary markers installed along the entire line. They weren't decorative or subtle. They were precise, visible, and placed exactly where the legal property line existed, cutting cleanly through areas that had long been treated as part of my neighbor's space. The effect was immediate. What had once been an abstract concept, a line on paper, was now a physical reality. And it didn't go unnoticed. Within hours of the markers being placed, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet observation that had defined my neighbor's behavior turned into something more direct. Her movements around the property became more frequent, more deliberate. She didn't approach me, didn't initiate any form of conversation, but the tension was unmistakable. The boundary had been challenged. And now it had been confirmed. But marking the line was only the beginning. Because the survey hadn't just revealed where the boundary was, it had revealed what lay beyond it. The section of land that extended into her yard wasn't insignificant. It included carefully maintained landscaping, decorative elements, and a portion of space that had clearly been integrated into her daily use. It wasn't just extra land. It was part of her routine, her environment, her sense of ownership. And legally, it wasn't hers. The question was how far to take it. Reclaiming the land didn't require immediate construction or confrontation. It required clarity. So the next step was documentation, again. Photographs of the current layout, measurements aligned with the survey, records of how the space was being used. Everything was cataloged with the same precision as before. Not for conflict, but for protection. Because if the situation escalated, and it likely would, every detail needed to be accounted for. The HOA, for its part, remained unusually quiet. There were no new notices, no attempts to reinterpret the situation, no sudden enforcement actions. The shift in their tone from Chapter 2 had carried forward, but now it felt more like distance than hesitation, as if they were intentionally avoiding involvement in something that had moved beyond their control. And in a way, they had. The issue was no longer about aesthetics or compliance. It was about property rights, clear, documented, and legally enforceable, which meant the HOA had very little authority left to exercise. That left only one variable: my neighbor. The first sign of escalation came not through official channels, but through action. Small changes at first, adjustments to the landscaping near the boundary, subtle shifts that suggested an attempt to redefine the space without directly acknowledging the markers. It was quiet resistance, the kind that avoids confrontation while still pushing back. But it didn't last, because the markers didn't move. And the line they represented didn't change. As days passed, the adjustments became more noticeable. Items that had once crossed the boundary were pulled back. Pathways were subtly redirected. The space was being reshaped, not by choice, but by necessity. And that was the real shift. For the first time, the control she had exercised over the situation was being reduced, not through argument, not through enforcement, but through facts that couldn't be ignored. Still, the core issue remained unresolved. The land was legally mine, but it hadn't been formally reclaimed. The markers defined the boundary, but they didn't enforce its use. The space beyond them was in transition, caught between what it had been and what it was now required to become. And that transition created an opening. Because enforcing property rights doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it just requires completion. The idea formed gradually, shaped by the same logic that had driven every step so far. If the fence had triggered the conflict, and the survey had resolved it, then the next move needed to do more than defend. It needed to finalize. Not just the boundary, but the outcome. A second fence wasn't necessary in the traditional sense, but a continuation of the existing one, extended along the newly confirmed boundary, would do something more powerful than any notice or document ever could. It would make the line permanent, visible, unavoidable, and entirely within my rights. As I reviewed the plans, aligning them with the survey and the existing structure, the path forward became clear. This wasn't escalation for the sake of conflict. It was resolution through enforcement. The kind that doesn't rely on permission, only on proof. And now, I had all the proof I needed. The decision to extend the fence wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, precise, and rooted entirely in what had already been proven. By this point, there was no uncertainty left, only execution. The boundary had been legally established, the markers had made it visible, and the space in question had already begun to shift under that new reality. All that remained was to make it permanent. The plans for the extension followed the exact same standards as the original fence. Same materials, same height, same design. There was no attempt to exaggerate or provoke. In fact, the consistency was intentional. This wasn't about creating something new, it was about completing what had always been mine. Before moving forward, I ensured everything was documented one last time. The survey, the legal confirmation, the HOA guidelines, all reviewed again to eliminate even the smallest risk of dispute. The last thing I wanted was to give anyone an opening to challenge the construction on technical grounds. There wouldn't be one. When the work began, it didn't take long for the neighborhood to notice. Construction, even at a small scale, has a way of drawing attention. The sound of tools, the presence of workers, the gradual transformation of space, it all created a visible shift that couldn't be ignored. And unlike the first fence, this one didn't just define a boundary. It moved it. The line extended cleanly across the newly confirmed property edge, cutting through what had once been an uninterrupted stretch of my neighbor's yard. The markers that had been placed days earlier now served as guides, each section of fencing aligning perfectly with the legal boundary. There was no ambiguity left, and no room for interpretation. The reaction was immediate, though not direct. My neighbor didn't approach, didn't attempt to stop the work, didn't engage in any visible confrontation. But the change in her behavior was unmistakable. The calm distance she had maintained was gone, replaced by a constant presence near the construction area. She moved closer, lingered longer, watched more carefully. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was realization. Because the extension wasn't theoretical. It was happening. And with every section that went up, the space she had once treated as her own was being redefined in real time. The HOA, for its part, broke their silence, but not in the way they had before. Instead of notices or fines, they sent a request. A formal inquiry asking for confirmation that the construction complied with community guidelines. The tone was neutral, almost procedural, but the timing made the intent clear. They were being pulled back into the situation. But this time, the dynamic had changed. I responded with the same approach that had shifted the balance before: documentation, precision, and clarity. The survey was included, along with a detailed explanation of how the fence aligned with both property boundaries and HOA regulations. Every potential concern was addressed before it could be raised. The response from the HOA came quickly. Approval. No conditions, no warnings, no additional requirements. Just confirmation that the construction was compliant and within my rights. It was a complete reversal from where things had started. The same organization that had once issued fines and demands for removal was now formally recognizing the validity of the project. And that recognition carried weight. Because it didn't just validate the fence, it validated the boundary. By the time the final section was installed, the transformation was complete. What had once been an open, undefined space was now clearly divided. The fence stood as a physical representation of everything that had been established over the past weeks: legal ownership, enforced boundaries, and a shift in control that could no longer be questioned. But the impact went beyond the structure itself. The space on the other side of the fence, what had been absorbed into my neighbor's routine, was no longer accessible in the same way. Pathways had been interrupted. Layouts had been altered. The flow of her property had changed, not by design, but by correction. And that change forced an adjustment. The subtle resistance that had followed the placement of the markers disappeared. There were no more attempts to redefine the space, no quiet shifts in landscaping, no gradual encroachments. The line had been drawn, and now it had been reinforced. There was nothing left to contest. Still, the situation hadn't reached its final point. Because while the fence had resolved the physical boundary, it hadn't addressed the underlying imbalance that had allowed the conflict to begin in the first place. For years, the assumption of ownership had gone unchallenged. The space had been used, shaped, and integrated without question. And that history didn't disappear overnight, even with the legal reality now fully in place. What remained was the question of accountability. Not in the form of confrontation or retaliation, but in the form of recognition. The land that had been incorrectly used wasn't just reclaimed. It had been maintained, modified, and incorporated into another property for an extended period of time. And while the fence had corrected the boundary moving forward, it didn't address what had already occurred. That realization introduced a new layer to the situation. Because enforcing property rights doesn't always end with reclaiming space. Sometimes, it continues with redefining what that space represents. As I reviewed the final layout, walking the length of the fence and observing the newly established boundary, the next step began to take shape. It wasn't about escalation. It wasn't about conflict. It was about completion, the kind that leaves no loose ends. And with the boundary now fully secured, the path to that final step was clearer than ever. With the fence completed, the situation should have felt finished. The boundary was no longer disputed. The HOA had formally stepped back, and the physical division between properties was now undeniable. From the outside, it looked like the conflict had reached its natural conclusion. But resolution and closure are not always the same thing. Because while the land had been reclaimed, the reality of how it had been used for years still lingered beneath the surface. The fence corrected the present, but it didn't erase the past. And that past carried implications that couldn't simply be ignored, not if the goal was to fully settle the matter. For days, I observed the new dynamic. The space on my side of the fence was now entirely separate, untouched, and clearly defined. What had once been blended into my neighbor's yard now stood apart, quiet and unused. It was a portion of land that had effectively been hidden in plain sight for years, only now revealed through legal clarity and physical structure. And on the other side, the adjustment was still ongoing. The change had disrupted more than just a layout, it had altered a routine. The areas that had once been freely accessible were now blocked, forcing a reorganization that couldn't be avoided. The landscaping, the pathways, even the visual flow of the property had shifted in response to the new boundary. There was no resistance left, only adaptation. But even as that adaptation took place, one fact remained unchanged. The land had been used without legal right for an extended period of time. Not through a formal agreement, not through shared understanding, but through assumption. And assumptions, when left unchallenged, often create a sense of entitlement that doesn't disappear easily. That's where the final step came in. It wasn't driven by emotion or revenge. It was driven by completion, the idea that a situation should be resolved not just on the surface, but in its entirety. And in this case, that meant addressing the full scope of what had occurred. I returned to the documentation. The survey, the photographs, the records of how the land had been used. Everything was already in place, but now it was being reviewed from a different perspective. Not just as evidence of ownership, but as a record of occupation, how the space had been integrated, maintained, and treated as part of another property. That distinction mattered. Because while reclaiming land is one form of resolution, recognizing its prior use is another. And in many cases, that recognition carries legal weight, particularly when the use has been continuous, visible, and without formal permission. So I consulted the same attorney again. This time, the conversation went deeper. Not about boundaries or fences, but about rights that extend beyond simple ownership. The discussion centered on past use, on the concept of compensation for unauthorized occupation, and on the options available to address it. The answer was clear. There were grounds to pursue further action. Not in a dramatic or aggressive way, but in a structured, legal manner. A formal notice could be issued, one that outlined the history of the land's use, referenced the survey, and requested acknowledgement of the situation. It wouldn't demand confrontation. It wouldn't escalate unnecessarily. But it would establish accountability. And that was the key difference. Up until this point, the situation had been about proving a fact, that the land belonged to me. Now, it was about recognizing the implications of that fact over time. The notice was drafted carefully. Every detail was precise, every claim supported, every statement aligned with the documentation that had already been established. It wasn't written to provoke a reaction. It was written to stand on its own, clear, factual, and difficult to dispute. When it was delivered, the response wasn't immediate. And that silence said more than any argument could have. Days passed without acknowledgement. No attempt to challenge it, no effort to dismiss it, no return to the behavior that had defined the earlier stages of the conflict. The shift that had begun with the survey and solidified with the fence had now reached a deeper level. Because this wasn't about a structure anymore. It was about responsibility. Eventually, the response came, not through confrontation, but through compliance. The details were handled quietly, without escalation, without the need for further action. The acknowledgement was made, the situation addressed, and the matter settled in a way that reflected the reality of what had occurred. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. But it was complete. And that completeness changed everything. Because the balance that had once been skewed, through assumption, through enforcement, through pressure, had now been fully restored. Not just in terms of land, but in terms of control, authority, and outcome. The fence had marked the boundary. The notice had finalized it. And the space that remained on my side was no longer just reclaimed land. It was a symbol of a process that had moved from defense to resolution, step by step, without deviation. As I walked along the fence one final time, the difference was clear. What had started as a challenge to something as simple as an ugly fence had unfolded into a complete redefinition of ownership, one that extended beyond the visible and into the structural realities that govern property itself. But even with everything settled, there was one final realization. The outcome hadn't been about taking something away. It had been about taking everything back. By the time everything was settled, the neighborhood had changed in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but impossible to ignore once noticed. What began as a dispute over an ugly fence had quietly reshaped the entire dynamic of authority, perception, and boundaries within the community. Not through confrontation or spectacle, but through a sequence of actions that had steadily replaced assumption with fact. And people had been watching. At first, it had been subtle. Glances from passing neighbors, slowed footsteps near the property line, quiet curiosity masked as routine movement. But as the process unfolded, from the survey to the markers, from the fence extension to the final resolution, the attention became more focused. Not because of the conflict itself, but because of how it ended. There had been no dramatic outbursts, no escalating arguments, no visible attempts to force an outcome. Every step had been deliberate, documented, and grounded in something that couldn't easily be challenged. And that approach had done more than resolve a single dispute. It had set a precedent. The HOA, which had once acted with confidence and authority, now operated with a noticeable shift in tone. Their communications across the neighborhood became more measured, more precise. Notices were less frequent, and when they were issued, they carried a level of detail that hadn't been present before. It was as if the entire system had been recalibrated. Not weakened, but corrected. Because the situation had revealed something fundamental. Authority without verification is fragile. And once that fragility is exposed, it doesn't go back to what it was. My property, now fully defined and secured, stood as a quiet example of that shift. The fence, once labeled as a problem, had become something else entirely. It wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was a statement. Clean, consistent, and aligned exactly with what had been proven. There was no excess, no exaggeration, no attempt to make it more than it needed to be. and that simplicity gave it strength. On the other side, the adjustment had settled into permanence. The space that had once been integrated into my neighbor's property was no longer part of her routine. The landscaping had been redesigned, the flow of the yard altered to accommodate the new reality. What had initially been a disruption had evolved into a new normal, one that no longer relied on borrowed space. There were no further notices, no additional complaints, no attempts to revisit what had already been resolved. The conflict, in every practical sense, was over. But its impact remained. Because situations like this don't just end, they leave behind a framework, a reference point that others observe, learn from, and adjust to. And in this case, that framework was built on a simple principle. Clarity outweighs assumption. That principle extended beyond my property. Other neighbors began to take a closer look at their own boundaries. Surveys were requested, old documents reviewed, markers placed where there had once been only estimates. It wasn't widespread or dramatic, but it was noticeable, a quiet ripple effect that spread through the community. People were no longer relying on what they thought was true. They were confirming it. And that shift created a different kind of environment. One where disputes were less likely to begin, not because rules had changed, but because understanding had improved. The invisible lines that define ownership were becoming visible, not just physically, but conceptually. As for the neighbor at the center of it all, her presence became more distant. Not in a way that suggested ongoing tension, but in a way that reflected acceptance. The certainty that had once driven her actions had been replaced by something more grounded, an understanding of limits, both legal and practical. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened, no attempt to revisit or reinterpret the outcome. Just distance. And in this context, distance wasn't avoidance. It was resolution. Because everything that needed to be established had already been established, clearly, completely, and without ambiguity. Looking back, the progression was almost methodical. A complaint led to a response. A response led to verification. Verification led to discovery. Discovery led to enforcement. And enforcement led to completion. Each step built on the last, not through escalation, but through consistency. There had been no shortcuts, no reliance on assumptions, no attempt to win through pressure alone. Only a steady movement toward something that could stand on its own. And in the end, that made all the difference. The fence remained exactly where it was meant to be. The land on my side remained exactly as it was defined. And the space between those 2 points, once a source of conflict, became something else entirely. A boundary that no longer needed to be questioned. Because it had already been proven. The story didn't end with a dramatic moment or a final confrontation. It ended with stability, the kind that doesn't draw attention, but holds its ground regardless. And in a neighborhood where lines had once been blurred, that stability became the most powerful outcome of all.